In this and the following lectures, we're going to apply what we've already learned about mood episodes and talk through the diagnostic criteria for particular mood disorders. Now, there are a lot of mood disorders included in the DSM, and these mood disorders fall into one of two categories: bipolar and related disorders and depressive disorders. For the sake of this class, the bipolar and related disorders you'll need to be familiar with are bipolar 1 disorder, bipolar 2 disorder, and cyclothymic disorder. And the depressive disorders you'll need to be familiar with are major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Though it would probably be worthwhile to familiarize yourself with the other types of mood disorders in the DSM, they won't be included on any of the exams. But they are very interesting to read about. So let's get started by talking first about bipolar and bipolar-related disorders. As you may recall, the DSM specifies 3 types of episodes, the presence or absence of which serves as the diagnostic criteria for a number of mood disorders, like depressive episodes, manic episodes, and hypomanic episodes. In order for someone to be diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, he or she must have experienced at least one manic episode, the occurrence of which cannot be better explained by another disorder. Really, it's that simple. But you also have to read between the lines, because what the diagnostic criteria don't say explicitly, but what they do mean is that a person could also have had depressive episodes, hypomanic episodes, or both alongside these manic episodes. But those episodes don't matter, regardless of whether the person has experienced any other kinds of mood episodes. If they've had a manic episode, then by definition, the only thing they can be diagnosed with is bipolar 1. For bipolar 2 disorder, the diagnostic criteria get a little bit more complicated. So first, in order to meet diagnostic criteria for bipolar 2 disorder, the person must have experienced at least one hypomanic episode and at least one major depressive episode. But they can't have ever had a manic episode, because if you remember what I said just a second ago, if a person has experienced a manic episode, then they would be diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder. Like bipolar 1 disorder, the mood symptoms of bipolar 2 disorder cannot be better explained by another disorder. And finally, the diagnostic criteria stipulate that the symptoms of depression, or the unpredictability caused by frequent alternation between periods of depression and hypomania, causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Now, I just want to sit on this idea for a moment and point out 2 things. First, if you remember back, experiencing significant personal distress or impairment in functioning was not a diagnostic criteria for mania. The reason for that is something we'll talk about in class. But also, if you look carefully at what the diagnostic criteria are saying here, they're specifying that the hypomanic symptoms alone are likely not going to cause distress. And that makes sense when you think back to the diagnostic criteria for hypomanic episodes overall. But instead, what this is saying is that either the depressive symptoms or the changing between depressive symptoms and hypomanic episodes, that's what's causing the distress or the impairment. Now, for both bipolar 1 disorder and bipolar 2 disorder, there are a number of specifiers that the DSM identifies. There are specifiers to indicate what is the most recent type of episode, specifiers about severity and presence of psychotic symptoms, and also a host of additional specifiers. So, for example, I can include in my diagnosis of bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorder a statement that explains what the most recent episode was. Was it manic, hypomanic, or depressed? And I would do this for a couple of reasons. First, it would help me keep track of what was going on with my client's mood when I started working with him or her. Second, it also allows me a better way to describe my client's symptoms and communicate more effectively with other practitioners. So a diagnosis of a client might read, for example, bipolar 1 disorder, most recent episode manic. I can also use specifiers to describe the severity of symptoms, the presence of psychotic symptoms, or if the person is in remission. So let's take these one at a time. As I mentioned during the lecture on diagnosis, one of the things that changed from the DSM-4-TR to the DSM-5 was to replace the Global Assessment of Functioning, or GAF score, with a narrative description of symptom severity. So the DSM-5 provides 3 general severity of symptoms: mild, moderate, and severe. What's meant by mild is that the person only experiences the minimum number of symptoms. So in the case of bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, the person would only have 3, or in the case of only irritable mood, 4 symptoms, no more than that, and that the symptoms would be distressing or slightly impairing, but also somewhat manageable. Specifying bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 as moderate means that the symptoms are somewhere between mild and severe in terms of the number of symptoms or their implications. And if the diagnosis is specified as severe, that means that either there are a lot of symptoms in excess of what is necessary to make the diagnosis, and or that the distress or impairment is unmanageable. So if I were to try and integrate the severity into my diagnosis, I might diagnose someone with moderate bipolar 1 disorder, most recent episode manic. If psychotic features were present, which if you remember includes the presence of hallucinations or delusions, I would also want to note that. So, for example, I could amend my diagnosis to read moderate bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features, most recent episode manic. But remember that the with psychotic feature specifier is only relevant for bipolar 1 diagnoses, as the presence of psychotic features automatically categorize symptoms as manic rather than hypomanic. In addition, if the person is no longer having symptoms but did in the past, then I can specify the disorder as in either partial or full remission. Partial remission means that the person still has some symptoms that are negatively affecting their life, but not enough to meet diagnostic criteria. Full remission means that none of the symptoms are present to the extent that they are negatively affecting the person's life. Finally, there's a whole slew of additional features that can be specified. So, for example, if someone is also experiencing some anxious symptoms, but not enough for the person to be diagnosed with a co-occurring anxiety disorder, then I might say the person has moderate bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features and anxious distress, most recent episode manic. Alternately, if the client I was working with seemed to cycle or change between mood states very quickly, I could specify that the client experiences rapid cycling. The list of these specifiers goes on, but just know that the reasons for these specifiers, which you can read about more in your book or in the DSM, is to help you craft the most comprehensive and useful diagnosis as possible. Because remember, everyone's experiences of psychiatric disorders is different. So by using specifiers, we're better able to describe what our individual clients are experiencing. The last diagnosis that I want you to be familiar with, which also falls under the header of bipolar and related disorders, is cyclothymic disorder. And the best way to think about cyclothymic disorder is as a type of subclinical bipolar 2 disorder. So here are the diagnostic criteria. First, for at least 2 years or at least 1 year in children or adolescents, the person must have experienced numerous periods during which they were experiencing hypomanic symptoms that did not meet criteria for a hypomanic episode, and numerous periods with depressive symptoms that do not meet criteria for a major depressive episode. In other words, the person has had both hypomanic and depressive symptoms, but neither of those groupings of symptoms were severe enough that the person met criteria for either having a hypomanic episode or a depressive episode. Next, the diagnostic criteria for cyclothymic disorder specify that during that same 2-year period, or again, 1 year for children or adolescents, the hypomanic and depressive periods have been present for at least half the time, and the individual has not been without symptoms for more than 2 months at a time. So in other words, the symptoms have been chronic. At no time has the person met criteria for a depressive, hypomanic, or manic episode. The symptoms are neither better explained by another disorder nor attributable to a medical condition or substances. And finally, that the symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And we can talk more about this in class, but we'll stop there for now, and in the next lecture, we'll cover depressive disorders.